I'm Laura Neuman, Access to Information Project Manager and Assistant Director of the Americas Program, and I would like to welcome you to the Carter Center and to the opening of the International Conference on the Right to Public Information. We're so pleased to see all of you here and that many of you were able to struggle through some bad weather in the north and in Chicago and elsewhere. We're joined today by more than 120 colleagues from 40 countries, representatives of government, civil society, media, the private sector, regional and international bodies, donor agencies, foundations, and scholars, all united, committed to the continuing advancement of the right to information. Our opening will begin with former United States President Jimmy Carter, and then we will go on to hear from Minister of the Presidency from Bolivia, Juan Ramon Quintana, who is representing President Evo Morales. We will then hear from Minister Mustafa Traoré, Minister of Justice from Mali, representing Amadou Touré. I will then offer a few comments of background for the conference and our objectives for the coming days, and if there is time, we'll take questions. I think President Carter needs no explanation, and so if he's okay with that, in lieu of giving a long and beautiful bio, I think I'll invite him up to the podium to begin with our presentation.
Well, first of all, I want to welcome to the Carter Center former presidents and maybe future presidents and representatives of the government in very high positions, scholars, experts on this subject, and many others. We're delighted to have you here. Although I know that time is limited, I want to start with a story that illustrates a point very clearly, and that's about a young veteran who came back from the Vietnam War. And he was a very quiet, very timid former soldier. At that time, veterans of the Vietnam War were not very popular. And he went into a local tavern and he ordered a glass of milk. And he was there drinking his milk, and a burly man came in and began to abuse the little veteran, pushing him around. The little veteran tried to avoid any sort of unpleasantness with this great big guy. And finally, the man had several drinks, and he slapped the little veteran on the side of his cheek and very hard and said, "That's a karate chop from North Korea." The veteran didn't say anything. He just tried to avoid the man. After a while, the guy hit him on the other side, knocked him off on the floor. He said, "That's a jiu-jitsu jab from Japan." The young veteran got up from the floor and walked out the front door and was gone about 10 minutes. He came back in, walked up to the big guy and hit him right between the eyes, knocked him head over heels under a table. And the little veteran said to the bartender, when he wakes up, "Tell him that's a tire tool from Western Auto." Well, I think that in many ways, legislation to give people the right to know what's going on in the government is a very important tire tool for citizens to make sure that they can help control their own government and protect themselves from abuse. I've been involved with the question of access to information ever since I first got involved in national politics. I was elected president because of an absence of adequate and accurate information to the American people. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and after the Vietnam War was conducted under extreme secrecy, with inaccurate information being given to our people, and after investigations of our CIA were conducted that revealed that they were acting illegally, plotting even the assassination of leaders around the world whom our government did not like, there was a time of reception for me, because I promised that I would always tell the American people the truth and that I would open up the government to better understanding by the citizens of this nation. I was also aware of the oppression of human rights in many other countries. I won't go into detail about it, but just take South America, for instance. Many of the countries represented by you from South America and the Caribbean, Central America, suffered in those days by oppressive governments. either military dictatorships or authoritative regimes, beginning in the South and Argentina and Chile and all the way up through the continent. And I thought the best way to help address this problem of our neighbors was to promote basic human rights. So I established a policy in my inaugural address by saying that human rights would be the foundation of the foreign policy of my country. And I ordained every ambassador on earth that represented the United States of America as my personal human rights representative. And the embassy there in our land, in your land, was a haven for people who suffered from persecution by their own government. I also tried to correct some of the abuses at home of excessive secrecy. And very early after I was elected president, I issued an executive order. And I'll quote just a little bit from it. The public is entitled to know as much as possible about the government's activities. Classification of documents should be used only to protect legitimate national security secrets and never to cover up mistakes or improper activities. While some material must be classified, the government classifies too much information, too highly and for too long. These practices violate the public's right to know, imposes unnecessary costs, and weakens protection for truly sensitive information by undermining respect for all classification. I wanted things that were classified secret really to need to be secret, and for all other information that didn't involve our national security to be available to the public of the United States. I think I can say quite accurately this obsession with openness and transparency of governments is still an obsession of those of us here at the Carter Center. And this is because we see so many human rights violations, corruption in government, and marginalization of citizens brought about and made possible by secrecy of government officials who don't want to let their own people know what's going on in the people's government. This leads to sustained aggravation and anger and sometimes violence and even sometimes to civil wars as people object to what their government is doing when they are deprived of a right to know. Most of the Carter Center's work is in the field of health care, mostly in Africa. But we have also participated now in trying to hold 67 honest elections since the Carter Center began this effort. Every one of these was a troubled election. If they weren't in trouble, we wouldn't waste our time by going there. And they range from Palestine and Guyana to very large countries like Indonesia. And we'll soon be going in just a few days to Nepal, if that election goes through, where they will write a new constitution that will establish the right of people to have access to the government and to participate as equal citizens within that troubled but beautiful little country. This is very important. We've seen violations of honest elections, for instance, in Nigeria 3 different times. They've gotten worse progressively. And as you know, a stolen election has brought about very great violence at the present time in Kenya. These are troubles brought about almost exclusively by the fact that powerful leaders, in order to stay in office, deprive their citizens of a right to honest governments and also to access to know what's going on within the government. The Carter Center has supported access to information regimes on kind of a test case in 4 core countries, and also helped at the regional level of Latin America. When I visited different nations, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Jamaica, Guyana, Mexico, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, and other countries, on various projects of the Carter Center, we almost always bring up the subject of access to information, because it is a key issue if the government is going to have the deserved trust of the people that are being governed. We've been pleased to see recently our colleagues in China passed a new government regulations issued by the leaders of that country. Also, President Touré in Mali asked us to help him pass an access to information law because we were trying to help Mali improve the quality of their administration and also make it more attractive for foreign investment to be made there in that great nation that has been deprived of many rights. We also work very closely in partnership with the World Bank and have served as advisors to the Organization of American States, to the Inter-American Development Bank, Transparency International. And although we contribute something, we learn even more from them. As you all know, access to information can change the landscape of an entire society, letting citizens participate, often for the first time, in public life, to set their own priorities that affect their future, to understand what the policies are of well-meaning governments, and to hold governments accountable for implementing policies once they are set through Constitution and the provisions of law. This fosters greater trust between the governed and the governors and increases the common interest of leaders and citizens in shaping a fruitful and progressive future for the nation. Both citizens in countries and also donors are very deeply interested in knowing that funds for health care, for education, for the promotion of employment, for all opportunities are expended properly. And quite often, this proper expenditure of development assistance is subverted by corruption, almost always within the framework of protective governments who don't want the citizens to know how they're spending the funds. But quite often, outside donors are more familiar with this problem than the people who live within the country itself and are deprived of information. We learned in Mali, for instance, that in that particular country at the time, a year and a half ago, the World Bank told us that of every $100 offered to Mali at the beginning of a year for development assistance, only $15 was spent. And for the entire continent of Africa, only $20 out of every 100 allocated was spent at the end of the year. Quite often this is caused by a lack of intimate involvement by citizens of the country who are supposed to receive the benefits and the government in charge. Access to information, as you learned in the superb presentation at lunch, I understand, pointed out that this access to information is a fundamental human right. There are now almost 70 countries with access to public information laws, but we really don't quite know in many instances what the effectiveness of those laws have been. Despite the demands and the needs of citizens, there have even been some regressions, some steps backward in some nations toward increased secrecy. My own country is a very troubling example of that. The United States is a prime example under the current administration, where more secrets have been created than at any other time in the history of the United States of America, where the executive branch now is making every effort to exclude the American people from the right to information. In 2006, 2 years ago, on the 40th anniversary of the U.S. Freedom of Information Act, I wrote an editorial for the Washington Post, for instance, that pointed out that law required that when a citizen asked for information, there was a 20-day deadline in that department providing the information. And I reread the editorial that I wrote just a few minutes ago, and I pointed out that in the Department of Agriculture, the average delay was not 20 days, but 905 days. And in the Environmental Protection Agency, the delay was 1,113 days. This is the United States of America, a country based on freedom and the right of its citizens to understand and control our own government. even when the Democratic Congress last year passed a legislation. The final vote was unanimous to increase the openness under this 42-year-old law and to create the Office of Ombudsman to represent citizens seeking information. The executive branch was shrewd enough to subvert the law that had passed our Congress unanimously. When the present administration submitted the budget for this next year, there was zero money for the ombudsman. And just to make sure that it was not effective, they transferred the ombudsman's office from the Archives Department to the State Department, which meant that it was no longer an independent agency. We transferred it rather to the Justice Department. The ability of me and other former presidents, President Reagan's and President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, to expedite the declassification of our own presidential archives is severely restrained by a generic and all-inclusive desire by the present White House to prevent access to information, even to these older documents that describe the events that happened when I was president and the other former presidents. By the way, we look forward to more freedom after next January. I know that I'm speaking. It's interesting that that's the first applause I've had. Thank you for it. I know that I'm speaking, as Laura has said, to more than 125 people from Latin America and from 36 or maybe 40 countries, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from China, from India, from Europe, and North America, who are impassioned, I hope, as we are, about the right to public information. There are representatives here from governments, civil society, the news media, from the private sector, international financial institutions, scholars, and donors. We thank you. We are assembled here in a safe place, a convenient place, a place where freedom of expression prevails, and where frank discussions of difficult and sensitive issues are possible. Let me close by saying that we are blessed by this diverse assembly. And during this conference, all of us will learn from each other and from experts the multiple advantages of having more information about our own governments and what practical steps can be taken to make these benefits available. I have confidence that during the next 2 days, we can produce an agenda, maybe a common statement that will serve as a blueprint for action to advance a universal right to information. With this information, all citizens will have a tool to protect themselves from abuse and to make sure their rights are honored. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Carter. I'd like to invite Juan Ramon Quintana to speak to us. Juan Ramon was named Minister of the Presidency in 2006. Prior to this, he spent many years serving as an official in the National Army of Bolivia. He has a degree in sociology and a master's of philosophy and political science. Minister Quintana is a distinguished political analyst and has focused some of his research on national security issues. And following him, I'll ask Minister Traor to come up. Mustafa Traor has served on President Touré cabinet for a number of years. He is presently Minister of Justice for Mali. Prior to this post, he worked in the Ministry of Planning for more than 20 years, serving as the Vice Minister for more than 5. So first, Minister Quintana.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, President Carter. Thank all of you who are organizing this important event in which you have
sociales para contribuir a fortalecer nuestra democracia.
Our democracies. I thank Jennifer McCoy and all of those who cooperate and collaborate with the Carter Center in this important effort. In the first place, I would like to begin by apologizing on behalf of President Evo Morales of Bolivia for his absence. Mr. President Carter, please accept his apologies. We have had natural disasters in Bolivia. There have been some very serious floods. And he also has on hand an important political agenda to continue with the development of democracy in Bolivia. Again, his most heartfelt apologies. I was practically, Mr. President, yanked from my office to be able to come here to Atlanta in representation of President Morales. I am very, very proud, and I feel it is a privilege to be here and make then a few remarks regarding the need for access to information and the need also that through good and appropriate information we can reduce insofar as possible the levels of corruption that undermine our democracies. There can be no doubt that many governments in Latin America over the past few years collapsed or were overthrown precisely due to the lack of transparency and the fundamental practices of corruption, and they fell because they failed to comply with their or fulfill their promises, and thus they completely became separated from their own societies. Today, Mr. President, we must begin to reflect and think about the fact that the struggle against corrupt regimes, the struggle against governments that undermined democracy, can also be a cause and a reason why these governments end up presiding or governing over unstable societies. Democratic governments were not able to conclude their terms, often due to corruption, and it is also the case that governments that confront corruption run the risk of being weakened. And that is precisely the case of my country, Mr. President. Today we are facing tenacious political resistance, the most tenacious political resistance, I would say, that democracy has undergone in Bolivian history. We are resisting strongly. We are a popularly elected government. We are a democratically elected government. We had 54% of the vote, the highest of any government elected in Bolivia, 54%, as I say, with great popular support. But at the same time, we came to a power, and one of the pillars of our campaign that we would struggle against corruption, and indeed we began struggling against intolerable practices, intolerable in a democratic government. And during lunch we saw a video. It was painful to see corrupt Peruvian officials that during the Fujimori government were handing over loads and loads of money to, in this case, owners of a television station, packets and packets of dollars. You could weigh them by the pound. In Bolivia, things were no different until 2 years ago. The difference being, however, that this thing of handing dollars was done essentially through an official cashier who would visit the office of the ministers and the deputy ministers and national directors and gave them then an amount of money that would allow these government officials to pass laws, approve irregular contracts, made it so that these officials would take ownership, literally, of the money paid by taxpayers. This was a common practice in Bolivia. $20 million per year, Mr. President, were being spent on public officials, the key public officials, accepting these bribes to reproduce corrupt practices. And nobody informed people that $20 million of dollars simply escaped from the national budget and were used then in this discretionary manner. The President of the Republic was formally to make 45,000 Bolivianos, which are $6,000, but in reality received $150,000 per month. Citizens thought this was an honorable president making $6,000 a month, but in reality he was receiving $150,000 per month. The military high command was formally, on paper, the highest officials, the commander of the armed forces, three-star generals, say $1,500 a month. Illegally, he was receiving $40,000 per month. The Ministry of the Presidency, which is essentially the person that is closest to the president, the minister closest to the president, is essentially the most perfect financial engineer the government had, because that was the person who cut all the deals, all the unimaginable deals of the executive government. No other government minister could do an illegal deal without the knowledge of the Ministry of the Presidency, of the third or fourth person, essentially, in the hierarchy of the executive branch. So the Ministry of the Presidency became essentially the regulating entity of the corrupt dealings of the Bolivian government. When we came to power, the President of the Republic, Evo Morales, disappeared these discretionary funds. He did away with them. And today, nobody receives a single Boliviano, which is our current currency, outside of the official and regular salary. The entire thing is transparent. The President himself cut back 60% of his salary and applied an austerity policy that today allows us not only to save resources, to better distribute them, but also makes it possible that public officials make a commitment to work with honesty. Mr. President, less than a year ago, or rather a little over a year, we modified the contracts that we had with 14 oil companies from all over the world that allowed us to multiply by 7 the oil-derived income in Bolivia. Earlier governments had signed contracts with these 14 transnational oil companies behind the citizens' backs, without informing even the parliament, as should have been done by a constitution. But worst of all, they were giving away the oil, and these companies then were able not only to export the oil, but also export their capital. The Bolivian state, since 1998, received only $300 million per year from 14 oil companies. Up till the year 2006, 14 large transnational oil companies, $300 million only. This meant, in practice, that these companies were giving were giving the state 18% of their profits and taking 82% of profits for themselves. When we came to government, we asked to see these contracts, and we as a government at the executive branch, nor in the legislative branch, nobody had copies of these contracts. The companies had to write home to headquarters to have the contracts sent over, and then they provided us with them. We have achieved a qualitative step forward in the new contracts with these companies, and now without expropriating a single cent from these transnational companies, without taking away any of their investment. We have, however, made it so that these 14 companies have remained in Bolivia, but with a substantial difference. Today, these companies give the Bolivian state 82% of their profits and send 18% home to their countries. Put otherwise, Mr. President, we Bolivians today receive $2.1 billion. Much different than the 300 million that we were receiving up until only 2 years ago. And what can we do? What have we done with these $2.1 billion? That 500,000 Bolivians in less than a year are now literate. They have they've been taught how to read. 8 million medical consultations. We have saved thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lives. We operate people are being operated for free. There are more computers in the schools. There are more basic services, more irrigation systems, more productive capacity. Mr. President, today the boys and girls in Bolivia receive an annual incentive or stipend to encourage them as an incentive to stay in school. The universities are receiving 7 times more from the budget than they did 2 years ago. The state governments are receiving 4 times more than they did 2 years ago. The municipalities are receiving 6 times more than they did 2 years ago. We have increased in terms of taxes. We are now getting 25% more from taxpayers, and have been able to build 2 times more roads than had been. In less than 2 years, we have built twice as many kilometers of road as in the 20 previous years. We public officials make less and less, but we are serving the people better and better. We work longer hours, but the entire process is more transparent. Mr. President, 2 months before reaching the government, a multi-million-dollar business was being done with the largest iron reserves in Bolivia, and one of the world's largest iron reserves. Most of them were given to a Brazilian company for $300 million. To get them to invest $300 million, that would allow them then, of which the Bolivian state was making 12 to 18 million. Fortunately, we won the elections, and this allowed us to revert this contract with this Brazilian company that had also planned to deforest 200,000 hectares of natural forests. And doing so, Mr. President, allowed us then, through our government, to change the contract. We now have a contract with a company from India where we are making $140 million per year for Bolivians. This is a contract 10 times better than the agreement we had with the Brazilian company. And at that, they were going to destroy nature, destroy the environment, and we were going to become really the victims of a major environmental crisis. That has been averted. With all of that said, with all of this progress, still those who are making most money out of this are now the most tenacious opponents of the measures I have been telling you about. And this is why, Mr. President, it is important indeed, fundamental, based on our experience, to fight, to struggle democratically, and insist through all possible democratic means to place then on the agenda this policy of access to information and struggle against corruption in our democracies, because our democracies have the obligation of redistributing the wealth of the nation to all Bolivians. To conclude, not only is it an obligation that those in government, elected by popular vote, elected democratically by the people, need to redistribute the wealth, we also have the obligation of signing contracts, of doing deals, public transactions vis-à-vis the nation. But public is the key word here. Like that, our governments gain credibility, gain legitimacy, are transparent, and help to close the gap between society and the state. A state is all the more powerful the more the state the more the people like the state and don't fear the state. A state will be stronger if it recovers its natural resources to redistribute these in society. The role, then, to conclude, of the communications media is important in terms of transferring information to society. For the second largest enemy after corruption that stands between the government and citizen is, unfortunately, some parts of the media that use lies as Trojan horses with which they go in and distort these type of measures. And this is because these media moguls were part of the power structure. Now that they're no longer in power, they are extremely worried and therefore go about distorting all types of information and work against the government. Therefore, we as citizens must have a strong, solid, ever more consistent policy of unconventional means of access to information that allow us to learn the truth about our governments and the role of that government. That role is to make available to all citizens and to the communications media more clear, more transparent, more objective information so that they do not confuse the people, and that those who yesterday were committed with corruption now work to overthrow governments that are struggling against that corruption and lack of transparency. Therefore, as a message, it is important to establish here, Mr. President, dear friends, colleagues, that one of the substantive formulas for the stability and consolidation of democracy is that governments be ever closer to their people, and that those who are in power are accountable, open up the vaults, take the streets, talk to people, and transmit all the information the citizens want, so that citizens don't feel fear, so that they're not confused by a process of change. The situation of my government, of our government, is a paradoxical one. Every day our government is weakened because it is struggling more and more against the corrupt. And the paradox is as follows. In Latin America, governments have been overthrown. The most corrupt governments have been overthrown because they had turned their backs on society. But now there is the risk in Latin America that to struggle against Latin America also is a risk to a democratic government. We must be careful. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President Carter,
Monsieur le ministre, représentant le président Evo Morales de Bolivie, Madame l'administratrice,
the representative of President Morales, to the administrator of the Carter Center, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of different countries here represented, ladies and gentlemen, representing international organizations and non-governmental organizations, honorable guests. The President of Mali, Amadou Touré, would have liked to be here among you this afternoon to exchange with you ideas on a subject as important as the right to public information. But due to conflicts in his calendar, he was not able to come, so he asked me to present his regrets and wish you the best success in your work. First, I would like to sincerely thank President Jimmy Carter for his kind invitation and for the consideration and high esteem he holds for our country, Mali. This is for us a sign of encouragement to always strive to do better. Excellency, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, you understand that it is a true pleasure for me and a great privilege to participate with you in this important conference on access to public information. Since pluralist democracy in March 1991 began in Mali, Mali has resolutely engaged in a process of reforming its administration and in restoring the credibility of the state with as main tool transparency of public work and greater consideration of the public in development programs. In this context, since January of 2004, the government of the Republic of Mali has been working with the support of the Carter Center in terms of putting in place a strategy for information within the administration with the general objective of improving the relationships between the government and its users by implementing Law 8802, that is, to improve the relationship between the administration and the public. This is a law that applies to the public services of the state, but also to the courts, the armed forces, the security services, and government services in general, to the extent that they're not contrary to other laws in place. Today, the implementation of this law with the support of the Carter Center is producing concrete results and is improving every day access of users to public services, which is equal for all users. It is in this way that they are informed of the administrative decisions, whether they're individual or collectively taken. Access to administrative documents is free to all. In addition, without damage to provisions in the way of publication of regulatory legislative texts, these are published regularly. Circulars, service memoranda, which contain a description of administrative procedures, are all made public. Ladies and gentlemen, the strategy for access to information within the administration is an integral part of the institutional development program for modernizing the administration in its element 6, which is called Relations with Users. It is in this regard that it contributes to the efficient implementation of the economic and social development law on the basis of which the president was re-elected in 2007, so as to make the state a model of good governance through the renewal of this public access, because the administration must be at the exclusive service of its users. It must be transparent and concerned with the proper use of public resources. This public will was reaffirmed by the Prime Minister of the government, Modibo Sidibé, in his statement of general policy in December 2007 before the National Assembly of Mali, when he indicated, and I quote, that the quality of governments is an indication of the success of the policies and program in the area of development. The performance of the public sector will be the major objective of the renewal of this public action. End of quote. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the strategy of access pursues two specific objectives. First objective, provide relevant information and quality services. Second objective, encourage a change of mentality and behavior among government agents so as to promote good governments in Mali. This strategy is based on control structure services within the administration based on the importance and the number of services provided to the users. The experiences within the structures allowed the government to identify obstacles to the implementation of the laws, but also to highlight appropriate solutions so as to develop a more complete system for accessing information in the long term. So as to clarify the role and responsibility of each person within this context, a collaboration document was signed within the Ministry of Work and its structures covering a period of 2 years. This agreement contains commitments on both sides. An evaluation and follow-up document was put in place, and this is a group that meets once a month. A second structure in the area of follow-up and monitoring is a committee for implementing this law within each structure run by the head of the structure. And finally, a provision which puts in place indicators so as to evaluate the results that have been obtained. I am pleased to specify, Mr. President, that the implementation of the strategy has made it possible for the government to organize the implementation of the strategy within the various ministries through an orientation office which communicates to the users the correct information on the formalities and procedures that are necessary for obtaining these services. It has also allowed the public departments to provide relevant information so as to improve their services to the citizens and so as to encourage a change of mentality and behavior by government agents. And this change is the source of the renewal of public services in Mali. Mr. President, before I finish, I would like to talk about corruption in my country. I am happy to report that since 2002, an instrument has been put in place. First of all, there was the creation of financial and economic hubs within 3 courts in Bamako, the capital, in Moti, and also in Kai. There was also the creation of the General Controller based on the Canadian model, which is an independent administrative authority. There was also the strengthening in the area of material and staff as regards inspections within the different ministerial departments, and the President of the Republic in the Social and Economic Development Program, which was responsible for his election in the first semester of 2008, has planned for the organization of the General States for fighting corruption at the very latest by June 2008. This will be a forum where all of the parties will be invited to debate the various subjects or being able to or coming up in the area of corruption. After this forum, it is expected there will be a platform on the basis of which there will be a new way of practicing business in our country. This is to tell you that this is a scourge that is of great concern to us. To conclude, Mr. President, I wanted to say that as regards access to information, that with the increase of information in the regional sources of information, Mali is working to improve access to information within the entire administration. This is one of the greatest challenges faced by the Malian democracy. The government will devote to this the energy that is needed, because this is a challenge as regards governance, which calls upon our state and requires all actors to participate, the state, civil society, and the private sector, so that together we can bring to this an appropriate response. Thank you. I wish you the best success.
As you've heard, the Carter Center has been working on the issue of access to information for almost a decade. And in that time, we've witnessed some great advancement, some faltering attempts, and unfortunately, some backsliding. We believe that we are now at a critical moment in the progression of the right to information. We have enjoyed progress, but what shall we do now? This conference offers the opportunity to consider our successes and the developments in the right to information arena, but also to look forward to explore the main impediments to the effective realization of this right. Together, we will examine the main political, institutional, and socioeconomic challenges, look at the special interests and their effects on the right to information, and identify ways to navigate these often turbulent waters. This conference will focus on the politics of establishing a vibrant right to information regime rather than the technical aspects. We will consider incentives and disincentives, explore the main impediments to the effective realization of this right, and how to shift the balance toward greater openness. Through panel plenary sessions this afternoon on the value of access to information, and later today, concrete country examples, we will prepare ourselves for tomorrow's working group sessions. As you know, each working group has been designed to focus on one specific issue that will be necessary to ensure the advancement and stop the backsliding. These topics were selected based on a preparatory conference that was held here in May of last year, as well as wide consultation with many of you. Each working group is tasked with considering the challenges and ideas for moving forward to come up with a plan of action. On Friday, we will meet together under the leadership of President Carter. We hope to produce the Atlanta Declaration, a declaration with principles that will lay the foundation, considerations that will capture the challenges, and an implementable action plan that will allow us to overcome the obstacles, increase consensus on next steps, and help ensure that all citizens enjoy the fundamental right to information. Thank you again for being here.